So shall I start? Yes. Welcome to our launch this morning, this afternoon, this evening, depending on where you are in the world, to our special issue of Art and Translation on the architecture of the Ottomans, Ottoman architecture. I'm called Ian Boyd-White. I am the editor of Art in Translation, which we set up in Edinburgh back in 2009. So we've been staggering on for some time now. And I'm extremely happy to say a few words at the start of this launch event for the special issue on Ottoman architecture. The words I want to say are entirely words of praise and thanks. So it's a fairly easy task for me to say thank you, thank you, thank you, and to praise our collaborators. Mary and I started to talk about this years ago, I think around about 2019 or even 2018. So it's been a long haul to get to where we are now. I can recall talking to her from Chicago. I was in Chicago and we talked on the phone in April 2019. That sticks in my head because that same evening I was hit by a taxi in Chicago. So it was a fairly striking day in my memory, my recollection. But it certainly goes back to 2019 or perhaps even earlier. Now, what started as a sort of smallish snowball of an idea soon became an avalanche. And in the end, it consumed 3 whole issues of the journal Art in Translation. You can find an open access version of the whole text on the Taylor and Francis site, which we have on the screen at the moment. And I think I'm right in saying that's up until the end of April, open access. So if you want to see what we're talking about, it's there. So moving on to the thanks. Mary and Sam, our guest editors, are the stars of this issue. They've done a fantastic job right from the very outset. The folio, as you may know, was put together in great haste for the 1873 Vienna Worlds Fair. And one can see that it was assembled in haste. It's a bit, as we say in Scotland, of a guddle. It's a bit of a mix, and it took a vast amount of work to get a sort of coherent version to translate out of these folios. The translator, Gay McAuley, was absolutely fantastic. This was an enormously difficult text to translate, enormously complicated. And to integrate the images with the glossary, with the translation, was a sort of superhuman task for the translator. And she has been absolutely staggeringly good right from the very outset. In Art and Translation, obviously, we work with all sorts of translators, the good, the bad, the extremely awful sometimes, who we don't publish, and the extremely good. And Gay was one of the very, very, very best, which I've ever worked with, or rather with whom I've ever worked for the last decade. So thank you, Gay, for an absolutely stunning performance. As you are, I'm sure, all know, this sort of task isn't about simply doing the first submission and saying, here it is, we've done it, please publish it. Endless small errors are found and creep in the process of editing. And the team, Mary and Sam and Gay, were absolutely fantastic in just pursuing the errors with dedication over months and months and months and months. And I can't begin to recall, we had a sort of so-called final proof, and then the second iteration of the final proof, then the third iteration, then the fourth and the fifth. It went on and on, trying to be finalized. But finally, we got a version which I think is extremely good. As you'll see, and as the publishers despaired, there were nearly 200 illustrations in this monster issue, which explains why it's a monster, to get all the pictures in. And for the pictures, we're extremely grateful to Harvard, our colleagues at Harvard, and in particular, David Roxburgh, who gave us very good images from the Harvard version of this book to work with. David was also an Edinburgh student, so that's a happy coincidence going back many years. Christina Keel, who's with us this evening, carried the burden as the organizer of all this, as the manager of this enormously complex task. She also worked endlessly and selflessly, and actually once spent an entire weekend recaptioning 200 images, which is extraordinary. So thank you very much, Christina. And finally, Mira Xenia Schwerder, sorry, who became the co-editor of Art in Translation fairly recently and has brought energy, enthusiasm, and skills in the art of the Middle East and the languages of the Middle East, for which we're extraordinarily appreciative. So thanks, Mira. So that's all I have to say in the way of thanks. But if I could also ask you all finally to spread the word about Art in Translation. It is an extraordinary resource for students and for scholars. So do speak to your librarians in your universities and say, we must have a translation, not a translation. We must, sorry, I've had a long day. We must have a subscription to Art in Translation. Okay, so I shall now pass on to Mary. Thanks very much.
Ian, thank you so much, and welcome everybody to this launch. It's wonderful to see so many of you joining us here to celebrate the launch of this English translation of the Ottoman Architecture book. On behalf of Sam and Gay, I want to express a few thank yous as well to those who've helped us to bring the translation to publication. First of all, a huge and heartfelt thanks to Ian Boyd-White for backing this translation project from the very beginning when we first proposed the idea to you. Thank you for having a vision for how it would fit within the journal and for your good humour through the process of making this happen. This triple special issue takes up a lot of the journal's real estate, and it doesn't conform to the more conventional structure of the journal, and Ian was willing to stretch and reconfigure the journal format to accommodate this book and its many, many illustrations. So Ian, thank you. Our thanks to our other colleagues in the Art and Translation team, Claudia Hopkins, who was a co-editor of the journal when we commenced the project. Our sincere thanks to Christina. It's already been mentioned, the efforts that she put in to format the images. That was a huge lot of heavy lifting. Our thanks also to Mira, who's recently joined the team, and special thanks for organising this launch. And our thanks also to the production team at Taylor and Francis, who worked with us on finessing the project and for making it free for a month. The editors also wish to thank Ahmet Ersoy, Basile Badu, and Unver Rustem, who brought a diverse range of expertise as our readers of the draft translation. And we too want to express our thanks to David Roxburgh and the Fine Arts Library at Harvard for providing majority of the images, and the Getty Research Institute Library, who supplied some of the images that weren't in the Harvard book. I also personally want to thank Samuel Williams and our translator, Gay McAuley, for a really productive collaboration on this project. It's indeed been a huge pleasure to work with you both. So a special welcome and thanks to our panelists today, to Ahmet Ersoy, to Zeynep Çelik, to Margaret Graves, and Erin Hyde Nolan. Before we invite each of our speakers, Sam, Gay, and myself are going to pose a question to one another about this publication. So Sam, let me lead off by asking you, why publish a translation of this text now, given that it's one that we know so well? And I'm particularly interested in your reflections on the significance of the text, given your background as an anthropologist who's worked in Turkey for many years and who's familiar with the debates in art history and Ottoman studies.
Gosh, how to phrase it? I mean, one of the things that's kind of so exciting about working on late Ottoman culture these days is not just the kind of interdisciplinary conversations that one finds the late Ottoman getting placed in, but also the kind of interregional, the comparative regional conversations where one finds the Ottoman space, the late Ottoman space popping up. just to begin with a vignette, that having been inspired as a master's student to work on this material, both with Mary and with Ahmet, the first place as a doctoral student I trained was partly in a Near Eastern Studies department in North America. Then when we actually, Mary and Gay and I began working on this material, I was in an art history institute that had a very strong concentration on Western Europe, shifted over, continued working on it in a large ethnographic museum, and then over the last several years have been in an anthropology institute that initially had a very strong dual focus on Africa and Eurasia, and now has a very strong focus on India and China. And it's just been, one of the things that's lovely about working on World Fair materials is that, you know, it's such a wonderful topic for connecting conversations in different regions, and often quite substantive conversations. But then when the topic kind of substantively comes to be about kind of living legacies of empire, how the living legacies of the Ottoman Empire ends up kind of taking shape in these different kind of cross-regional settings is intriguingly different. Having kind of begun in a kind of Near Eastern Studies department, I found myself referred to a few weeks ago in a conference, mainly with scholars from mainland China, as a scholar who specialized in Far West Asia. Though that was kind of tongue-in-cheek by a scholar based in Lebanon. I think that in terms of this translation we've done of this text, that the key, that it's framed in terms of kind of being a resource that can be used in these kind of conversations that we're seeing these days with Ottoman studies, and the key emphasis on accessibility, a text that's at once accessible in the digital form that's offered by the journal Art and Translation, so that it can be used by scholars in different settings in the global south that may not have kind of significant kind of physical holdings in their libraries, and to facilitate those kind of south-south conversations. And also accessible in the terms of the edition that we've prepared, that doesn't necessarily presuppose a very strong disciplinary formation in one discipline or another, or a particular kind of strong set of kind of presumptions about kind of people's regional competence. And just to end, that I think what Mary and I kind of found most as we were kind of working through Gay's translation is, as we frame it in the introduction, these very kind of strong, what we call kind of centripetal and centrifugal forces kind of pulling through this text. The more that one kind of tries to find the texts kind of reading the different writers together, the more one finds them kind of pulling apart in certain ways with their visions of Ottoman belonging. And the more one kind of finds them pulling apart in certain ways, they're kind of gravitating together in their ideas of Ottoman belonging. So that I think that as we kind of send this text out as a resource for different scholars working in different disciplines and working across different regions to themselves kind of pick at and pull apart in certain ways across their disciplines and across their regions, what we're kind of hoping is that the ways they pick at it and pull it apart and think about it comparatively can be partly shaped by those kind of late 19th century centripetal forces themselves. So at once kind of building on strong heritages of thinking about this late Ottoman in the context of the Near East, but also perhaps even emergently thinking about it in the context of a far, far West. So question to Mary. I talked a bit about the actual kind of written texts of the book. What do you make of the kind of sense of what we've kind of done with the images from that we've put together in the edition, in terms of how they, as it were, kind of pull together and pull apart?
Thanks, Sam. Well, it's been such an interesting process, because I guess coming to this project, I knew the book and I knew the excellent analyses of it by Zainab Chalik, who situated it within the contributions to the World Fairs, and of course Ahmet Ersoy's forensic analysis of the book, which offers a sustained sense of the political and cultural stakes of the project and the cosmopolitan teams of authors who created it. But the question was then, I guess, how to approach it, and really this question of the relationship between text and image prompted us to approach it as a material object, to see how the project and its propositions emerged in this conjunction of text and image. And just as there are different modes of writing present in the text, with the general history, the biography of monumental buildings, a theory of ornament, and so forth, so too in the image clusters, there's different approaches to visualizing Ottoman architecture. from the cluster of architectural drawings and to those that seek to foreground a theory of Ottoman ornament. Most of the illustrations hew pretty closely to the chapters they relate to, except for that great puzzle, which is a cluster of images at the end. And this actually led us to a kind of thinking about a set of choices in presenting the text in translation. We could have simply replicated the original text-image relationship, which has many inconsistencies. And one of the things of note is that throughout this book, there are explanations of plates that are incomplete, that don't appear in the image list. There's images that don't appear in the image lists, and sometimes two images are combined into one plate, and there's numerous other puzzles that presented themselves. So these inconsistencies are well known to scholars very familiar who've studied the text closely, but much less so to a broader audience. So it's something we wanted to make legible to readers who were new to the volume. So we decided to create an illustrations list, and the project was one of actually spending 3 days in the Victoria and Albert print study room, looking closely and creating this illustration list derived from the captions themselves in the explanations on the prints themselves and the information in the explanation of plates. And one of the things that does is foreground the authorship of each individual print, underscoring the individual contributions within the team. But it also foregrounds some of the inconsistencies between the different versions as they were acquired by different libraries, and in the case of the Victoria and Albert Museum edition, rebound. And that's something that we feel that could be further studied. It was also very instructive to spend time in front of the Ottoman Architecture book and Leon Pavier's book, looking at the illustrations and comparing the two made a year apart. And, you know, there's probably many other things that individuals would reflect on in this relationship between image and text, but I will keep moving for the moment. And the thing I'd like to do is invite our translator, who's done such a wonderful job. And Gay, the question I'd pose to you is to ask you about things that struck you about the process of translating. Gay, you need to unmute.
As you can tell, I'm not particularly good at all this technology. Sorry about that. Yeah, so I wanted to point out at the outset that I am not an art historian, and I don't have any expertise in architecture, let alone Ottoman architecture. My expertise is in theatre and performance studies. So work on this extraordinary book has taken me a long way out of my comfort zone, but it also means I came to it without preconceptions, ready to take it on its own terms. And it's been a joy to work on this with Sam and Mary and Ian. So the process, the first thing to say about the translating is that because the book contains a number of different voices, the translator's task is to stay true to each of them. So the preface by Mehmet Sevki is not written in French. So we're dealing with a translation of a translation, Turkish to French to English. And it feels very different from the rest of the text. I felt I was channeling a priest or an imam with those sonorous invocations to the divine, as well as a consummate official, excessively, to our view, sort of excessively worshipful references to the current sultan. So that was the technical dossier was the hardest to translate. It's very technical, great deal of very precise architectural terminology. So that really did. I really appreciated the advice from Basile Baudet there to help with all that, the very precise terminology. Montani is clearly passionate about the buildings, as can be seen in the dozens of exquisite drawings that he made of every tiny detail. And his essay is an attempt to distill into words the knowledge that he's acquired through such immersion. But he's not a very good writer. My impression is that he's not primarily a writer, that he would be much more at home making a point by drawing a quick sketch or a geometric diagram than using words. And this is one of the reasons perhaps for the rather dry nature of the dossier. I did wonder about his primary language. Was it Italian, or was it French with an Italian inflection, or was it Turkish? What language did he speak every day? And did this have an effect on his written French? This is, of course, something that we point out in the note about the translation, that the book contains a huge number of Turkish words. So as well as being in French, German, and Turkish, within the French text, there are a lot of Turkish words, sometimes translated, more often not. So, and this raised the question for us about whether this was an attempt by the writers to educate non-Turkish readers so that they would say mihrab rather than prayer niche, or saka rather than water carrier, for example, use the actual local term when there was no accurate equivalent in French, thus avoiding mistranslation or inappropriate connotations. Because of course a prayer niche, a mihrab is not just a prayer niche, but a particular beautifully decorated niche that indicates the direction of Mecca. So that just to say prayer niche could give the wrong connotations. So was it educational, or did it actually reflect the way these expatriate Europeans spoke? Did they occupy a linguistic space that was somehow between languages? But then you come to Victor Marie de Launay, the main author of the text. And for me, the 8 descriptive essays, each one devoted to a separate building, a particular building or monument, that's the real heart of the book for me. He's definitely a writer, and his essays were a joy to translate. They're more than ekphrasis, because he's not simply describing something visual, but evoking the complex experience of being there in that building, approaching it, entering, seeing, experiencing it. As Sam says in the introduction, these essays are less ekphrasis than choreography. And that's perhaps why they appeal so strongly to me as a theatre specialist. For the whole point about performance is that it takes place, literally, and to experience it, you have to be there. For de Launay, a building is an event, not something you look at, but somewhere to be. And I think that his essays are a wonderful example of writing about architecture. I'm sure modern writers could learn from that. The mix of history and information and anecdote and description, as well as that ability to evoke so powerfully the experience of being there. And I hope our translation is going to lead lots of people to visit these monuments with de Launay's text in hand, experiencing the buildings as he did, seeing them through his eyes. That's certainly my intention to do so. It's been a joy to work on this.
Okay, thank you so much. Now we are going to move to our panel of speakers. And what I'm going to do today is actually a very brief introduction to the work of each of them, and then we will move from one to the other. Each will speak for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to have a roundtable Q&A. So if anyone's inspired to ask any questions, please put them in the chat whenever you feel like it. And of course, we will ask you to raise your electronic hand at the end when we move to the quick Q&A. So leading off today, our first speaker will be Ahmet Ersoy, who's an architectural historian based at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul. Ahmet did his PhD at Harvard on the Ottoman Architecture book, and it is the subject of his monograph, Architecture and the Late Ottoman Historical Imaginary, Reconfiguring the Architectural Past in a Modernizing Empire. So it's wonderful to have Ahmet here. Our second speaker is Erin Hyde Nolan from Tufts University and Maine College of Art and Design. She's an expert in 19th century photography who's written about the Ottoman costume book, the book that, like the architecture volume, was created by the Ottomans in 1873 for the Vienna Worlds Fair. Our third speaker is Margaret Graves from Indiana University, whose groundbreaking work on modern Islamic art is now well known. And I commend to you her new edited volume on modern Islamic art. She's written a really thoughtful essay comparing the Ottoman Architecture book to a range of 19th century European texts on Islamic architecture and ornament. And our fourth speaker, Zainab Chalik from Columbia University, requires no introduction. For a long time now, she's been defining new directions for the study of 19th century Ottoman architecture, Ottoman photography, archaeology, and comparative empires. Her own work on the Ottoman Architecture book has stemmed back and moved across her work from her earliest monograph, Remaking Istanbul, and then framed in a new way in her book, displaying the Orient Architecture of Islam at the 19th century World's Fairs. But most recently, Zainab has made a major contribution through her anthology of translated Ottoman and Turkish texts. And it's a recent publication, Europe Knows Nothing About the Orient, a critical discourse from the East, 1872 to 1932. So without any further ado, I want to welcome the first of our speakers, Ahmet Ersoy, and invite him to screen share.
I think I would prefer start sharing my screen a bit later, if that's not a problem, so that you see more of me. Many thanks, firstly, to Mary and Sam and Gay and everybody involved in the project for inviting me, and also for undertaking this monumental project, for making this source available to a wider audience with a wonderful, meticulous translation. And of course, the book, Usulü Mimari, I'm going to keep on referring to it with its original Ottoman name, Usulü Mimari, in and of itself can be considered a project of translation, not only because it has these parallel texts in Ottoman Turkish and Greek and French and German, but also because it's a self-consciously intercultural text that attempts to reclaim the Ottoman architectural tradition and to translate it into the mainstream norms of modern art historical scholarship. So the present art in translation issue is, I think, very congruous with the original agenda and the globalizing aims of the publication itself. And I was reading Mary and Sam's introduction, which for me was a rewarding, really, truly rewarding experience, because the very textured, nuanced reading of the text that they offer made me reconsider many different unexplored dimensions of the text, such as Marie de Launay's phenomenology of place, his take on materiality, his take on the social institutionalization of architecture. And, you know, reading their introduction, there were moments when I said, of course, why didn't I think of this before? Really, it was a revealing and stimulating experience. So thank you again, and congratulations for your critical and very incisive reframing of this publication. I think one of the most penetrating observations that Mary and Sam make in the introduction is the question that they pose about whether we're talking about a text that hangs together, or is this a text that pulls apart? I think this is the, you know, the open-ended question that encapsulates the whole, I think, agenda or the atmosphere of the volume itself. And truly, this is a plural and internally complex text with a lot of inner inconsistencies and tensions. So my feeling is that through this introduction, this new introduction, you have embarked on an archival ethnography of this collaborative publication by focusing on the making of the book as a material object, focusing on the collating of texts and drawings, while spotlighting its gaps and fissures and incongruities and divergences. And in this context, Mary and Sam point out to certain inconsistencies and absences, and they point out to one very blaring and puzzling absence, and that's the absence of Léon Parvier that Mary just mentioned, the French architect who was a collaborator with many of the authors involved in the publication of Usul-i Mimari, and who himself published a similar book on early Ottoman architecture less than a year after the publication of the Usul-i Mimari. So this is, I mean, go figure. It's a mystery why his name was not mentioned in the text. But in my remaining time, which is not much, I am going to talk about another significant absence that makes the Usul-i Mimari an awkward text. And the absence is that of the Balyan family of royal architects, Ottoman Armenian architects, particularly Sarkis and Hagop Balyan. And now maybe I have to start sharing my screen. Here you go. I hope you can see it. So these people, these royal architects were responsible for designing almost all buildings hailed in the Usul-i Mimari as the archetypes, as the models of the nascent Ottoman Renaissance, the new revivalist idiom that emerges in the 1860s and that lingers on through the rest of the century. And so the Usul-i Mimari is not only a book, as many of you know, is not only a book on the history and theory of Ottoman architecture, it is the canonizing manifesto of an emerging revivalist style that is purportedly based on the generative principles of traditional Ottoman architecture. So this Renaissance, this revivalist style brings together a very eclectic, highly experimental, actually, blend of Ottoman, particularly early Ottoman, medievalizing Islamic Moorish and medieval European Gothic forms together, demonstrating the globalizing aims of the Ottoman Empire as both the leader of the Islamic world and as part of the Conference of Europe. So the buildings that you see on the screen that are representatives of the Ottoman Renaissance are mentioned in the book, in the Usul-i Mimari. And their architects are this team led by Sarkis Balyan that I just talked about, but those names are completely absent in the book. This is even more peculiar because one of the authors of the Usul-i Mimari, Montani, worked very closely with Sarkis Bey, with Sarkis Balyan, in the interior decoration of oh, here's Sarkis Balyan himself. I was lagging behind in slides, and his Valide Mosque, the interior decoration of which Montani was responsible, and Montani worked very closely with Sarkis Bey in the decoration of both this mosque and other buildings as well. On the far left, you see a color plate from the Usul-i Mimari showing Montani's rendition of this revived Ottoman style, and in the rest of the screen, you see its application in the mosque itself. And it's not just even Montani, also another contributor to the text, the French artist Eugène Mériard, who was a specialist on ceramics, is described in other sources as being the right hand of Sarkis Balyan. I mean, he was really within the close network of Sarkis Balyan. What you see on the screen is taken from a recent book by Büke Uras. And this is the unrealized, monumental, centrally domed royal mosque project for the Sultan Abdulaziz, with the centralized dome and 4 minarets that harks back to the classical Ottoman canon consolidated by Sinan in the 16th century. And very interestingly, this classical idiom is blended with all the Islamizing, medievalizing forms that are the hallmarks of the Ottoman Renaissance. So had it been realized, this building would have been the crowning example, the kind of the iconic climax of the Ottoman Renaissance as it was promoted in the Usul-i Mimari. But the architects, nevertheless, the Balyans remain as the silent reference in the pages of the Usul-i Mimari. And here's another example from the Aziziye Mosque, the unrealized mosque. So maybe I'll just stop sharing and try to wrap this up. So the absence of the Balyans, I think, is indicative of the Usul-i Mimari being a foundational text for the writing of Ottoman architectural history. And I think it lays the ground for two enduring tropes in the nationist rendition of art history that's adopted both by Turkish and non-Turkish scholars through the 20th century and even beyond. The first trope, the first enduring trope that is pioneered by the Usul-i Mimari is the linear progressive scheme for periodizing Ottoman history through an organicist sequence of emergence, golden age, decline, and revival. The kind of golden age being the 16th century and the decline starting in the late 18th century. While this historicizing scheme is conversant with modern European visions of historicity, it is also informed by one of the most enduring master tropes of local Ottoman historiography, the decline paradigm that goes all the way back to late 16th century. In the Usul-i Mimari, for the first time in writing, we see that this decline of Ottoman architecture is associated directly with non-Muslim and particularly Armenian master builders, who are held accountable for the infiltration of Westernizing forms in the late 18th century, portending the corruption of Ottoman architecture, the local indigenous kind of style and tradition. So the architects as culture brokers are singled out as actually cultural compradors, if you will, who are preparing the ruin of Ottoman architecture. So this is our first trope. The second trope, enduring trope, that we can trace back to the Usul-i Mimari is the dynastically oriented vision of Ottoman history, where the focus is mainly on the dominant Muslim element that is considered to be the primary agent, historical agent, the mover and shaker of cultural architectural activity. The Muslim dominant element that constitutes supposedly the genuine core of Ottoman society and culture, the principal point of reference. Whereas the non-Muslim agents are to be investigated in separate supplementary categories like Armenian architects or Greek architects of the Ottoman Empire. For the 1870s, when the book was written, this is completely in tune, I think, with the pro-dynastic biases and predilections and dilemmas of the Ottoman modernizing elites, who were straddling between visions of multi-ethnic, multi-religious pluralism, and on the other hand, an enduring, rooted kind of ethno-religious sense of hierarchy that made it very difficult for the bureaucratic elites to acknowledge the non-Muslims as fully equal subjects. So these two tropes, the historicizing and the exclusivist, or the dynastic, whatever you want to call it, and the absences that they entail, I think constitute one of the most lasting legacies of the Usul-i Mimari. And I think any critical discussion on the history of Ottoman art or architecture has to start with the acknowledgement of this absence, with the acknowledgement of the insidious embedded mechanisms of silencing. And I think, still as we speak, contemporary scholarship is trying to find ways to properly address and cope with such templates of absence. And on the occasion of celebrating this critical rendition of the Usul-i Mimari, I think it's proper to end with the acknowledgement and praise of these silenced agents of innovation, experimentation, and soul searching in late Ottoman architecture. I think I took too much time. I'm really sorry, but that's it from me.
Thank you, Ahmet. Our second speaker is Erin Hyde Nolan from Tufts University. And Erin, I'll just invite you to screen share with us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Mary. Actually, if you don't mind sharing my PowerPoint, but if you could also, like Ahmet, I would like to speak for a minute first, if that's okay. If you don't mind. It's fine. If you've already pulled it up, it's okay as well. Okay, thank you. So before I begin, I would just like to thank all of the authors, editors, and translators on the project, especially Mary, Sam, Gay, Ian, Mira, and Christina. Congratulations on your book. I'm so grateful to be included in the conversation today and honored to be among such esteemed company. It's really exciting as somebody who is, relatively speaking, newer to the field, to see such collaboration and to see that as a model for moving forward. So I really appreciate witnessing that and being invited into the conversation here. So like Ahmet, I really enjoyed reading your introduction, and after rereading the text and reading your introduction and re-examining the illustrations, I really started to think about what you all call this monumental album on Ottoman architecture in an expanded and relational context, especially in its relationship to, or in a relationship that I would call an unbounded relationship to other printed media that were made for the 1873 Vienna Worlds Fair. And of course, because of my own research, I am particularly interested in the intimacies between the Usul and the Elbise Osmaniye, of which we already know there are many, including a continuity in authorship between Seba, de Launay, and of course the use of Edem Pasha's Istanbul residence for the making of both of the albums. There is also, as you note in your introduction, this emphasis on timelessness, and to quote, you write, the Usul's rendition of the same delicate carved niches as compared to Pavillier has less sculptural illusionism and no damage. And this is the slide. If you don't mind pulling that up now, Mary, that would be great, the image that I'm referring to. And you write, is suspended in time. And the Elbise embodies this same temporal suspension, positioning Ottoman regional costumes as nostalgic, outmoded, and sometimes as antiquated as archaeological ruins. And one of the things, I don't have an image here, but I was thinking about this as Gay was speaking, that de Launay writes about buildings as a place to be in, to be lived in, rather than to be looked at. And I think very much the costumes in the Elbise are also meant to be understood that way, to be lived in, to be felt as a haptic experience, rather than something to be looked at. And so there's this sense of embodiment, I think, that is felt in both books. And the one intimate and material connection that I would really like to highlight today can be seen here in this comparison, and the replication of an anonymously made technical drawing of a niche in the main facade of the Green Mosque in Bursa. And I'm comparing here this drawing with the cover page for the Elbise Osmaniye. And so together, this form of the mihrab, the mukarnas, the pea spindles, and the modified squash leaves, which you can see in both drawings and more clearly here on the left-hand side in the Elbise, they're translated from one to the other. And of course, Pascal Seba did both, worked on both books. And so we can imagine, at least from a technical perspective, how they would easily have been, perhaps even in the same studio, translated from one book to the other. And it's interesting to think about the ways in which this visual translation or replication or quotation makes Ottoman architecture and ornament legible across media, across albums, and particularly for the works commissioned for the Vienna Exposition that were shown perhaps even in the same room in the Hall of Industry together. And so we see this sort of this conversation, this visual conversation that's happening very directly between the two albums. And as Ahmet has argued elsewhere, we must think about the usul as an artistic and material specimen of Ottoman technical aptitude for the art of printing. And I think we can see that here because it is that printing is directly in conversation with the Elbise, which is most often discussed, of course, as a photographic album, which I would also agree it most definitely is. But here, one of the things I will get to in a second, but is to think about this, the different printing technologies, both photographic and otherwise, that are actually working together and are very much a part of the same practice. And so what we can see with this comparison is that it demonstrates the importance of 19th century technologies in demarcating empire and citizenry during this period of global expansion. But what we also see is a raw and open media environment, one that is expanding and continues to expand rapidly throughout the next decades. And this comparison reminds us of the ways in which the printed page and the album page was often made and remade outside of its frame, outside of its origins, in order to tell stories about images and technologies that do not exist in isolation, that do not remain contained within the frame on the page, but instead overlap, merge, repeat, and continually engage with one another. One of the things that's exciting to me about looking at these two albums in comparison is to think about the way in which photography at this moment in time does not exist in isolation, right? And the history of photography as a field and the way that it's been written would like us to think about about photographs being made in isolation. And again, Ahmet has very much argued that this is not the case in the Ottoman Empire, particularly in the 1890s with regard to the illustrated picture press. But I think what we can see here is that it's not even just that photographs don't exist in isolation, but that the printed medium doesn't exist in isolation. And of course, because Sebah is involved in both cases, though we know that maybe he wasn't actually the printer, but hired somebody in his studio to do the printing, and that the photographs in the Elbise were phototypes and were carbon prints. So they weren't actual albumin photographic prints, but were actually made with a printed transfer process, much like the way in which other kinds of paper printed media was being made at the same time. And so this really messy and conversation between technologies and printed matter at the time brings these albums for me even closer together than I had originally thought. And I'm so grateful for realizing that in my rereading here. The last thing that I would like to touch on is to think about what we're looking at here, right? Which isn't actually photographs, but that I think there is more thinking to be done on this connection between the religious iconography here, the shape of the mihrab that is laminated on top of a photographic sartorial performance, right? Pasted onto the cover of the album, an album which desperately seeks to present the imperial domains as multi-confessional, multilingual, multi-ethnic, and multicultural. And so, in a way we could think about how this cover page acts as a portal, and what does that mean? What does it mean that this shape, that this space acts as a portal for the Viennese audience to enter the album with their feet standing on the ground of the Prater in Vienna, of the former royal hunting grounds, and to enter into this bona fide fashion show, right? Like what does that actually mean for this to be a threshold that they cross through, and for it to have important religious significance in the Ottoman context, but how does that religious significance translate then to the Viennese context? And so by constellating this image and technology exchange, we can see how printed albums, both photographic and otherwise, are intertwined with matters of religion and statecraft. And as manifold haptic storytelling objects, these albums were designed for circulation within the lap of with the elite in mind, but really for the lap of the familial. Yes, they were made for not just for anybody to buy, they were expensive, but they were meant to be understood by more than just the courtly circles. And yet they convey imperial control through their construction and consumption. And at the same time, they served as teleological devices, enforcing sometimes the not so soft power of the modernizing court. And as Ahmet just mentioned, entrenched religious hierarchies. Thank you. I think you're still muted, Mary.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you very much. Our third speaker is Margaret Graves, so I invite Margaret to screen share.
Thank you. Can you see this? Okay, lovely.
Yes.
So I would like to add my thanks to the chorus for the invitation. I feel like a bit of a shameful interloper at this event, to be honest. But I'm so delighted to see the publication of this and in a format that is so accessible. And it's been, I also want to really extend my thanks for your organization of the images, which I looking at them and thinking through them, I realized how much work had gone into that too. So particular thanks for that. So I think I'm sort of almost extending some of Erin's commentary here. I want to talk about the usul as a part of the print landscape of 19th century modernity, in a way that it is both enmeshed with and perhaps somewhat distinct from other print projects that also seek to capture architecture and its ornament. And they are doing this very much as part of statecraft, imperialism, and design reform, the way that these things are intersecting. Large in format, luxuriously produced, abundantly illustrated, and usually published in installments. There are a whole load of these elephantine superbooks that recorded architectural heritage. Now, often, as we know, they were created in response to architecture in territories that were being newly colonized by European forces. Also, closer to home, Islamic Spain, of course, is the starting off point for some of the best known of these. So you have Giro de Brangy's piece over here, swiftly sort of eclipsed by Jones and Goury's Alhambra volumes. As the century goes on, this print phenomenon really gains momentum. And these beautifully and expensively produced books, each of which builds on previous ones, they keep presenting these kind of peeled off motifs and whole design fields in great profusion as commodities, essentially, for a market that's hungry for innovation in applied design. They cannibalized each other very prodigiously. So I'm showing you the direct copy that you see in Kolb and Dolmetsch right near the end of the 19th century. Of course, it's a straight copy from Prix d'Aven here. Prix d'Aven himself was copying from others as well. Into this, this field, let me go back one. The usul presents itself as both, I think, related to and kind of distinct from those other architectural superbooks and compendia of ornament. Now, my own interest in this book has been on those pages and pages and pages of printed line drawings capturing Ottoman tilework designs towards the back of the volume. One of the things that really strikes me about these is the subtle but very consistent use of heavier lines in these to suggest a directional light source. So they're not completely uniform, the line on these. Typically, they have this heavier line, which usually just reads as a kind of marker of three-dimensionality. It gives this, you can see here and here, this indication that we have a kind of cast light source working from one direction. So it gives them these very faintly sculptural relief qualities, which is really very different from the flatness that you see in the few chromolithographic plates that are in the usul. And looking through page after page of these sorry, I keep jumping, page after page of these line captured designs with their this kind of system of sort of faintly suggesting relief. They brought to mind actually not the print pages of the Grammar of Ornament, but actually Owen Jones's working drawings for it. There are his paintings over here. What they made me think of particularly was the kind of transmutation that's sort of starting to take place as media seem to shift through the act of depiction and capture on the page. And I think this is going towards some of the things that Erin was talking about as well. In Jones, what I'm talking about is the fact that this was originally a brass plaque. It's now sort of being transformed into stone through Jones's painting of it with this heavy relief edge and this monochrome. Over here in the Usul, you have two-dimensional paintwork being turned into something that sort of looks at the edges of three-dimensional relief carving in these renderings. Now, this stylistic choice of the Usul's draftsmen, and they're pretty consistent with this throughout these images, it gives the design some solidity through this kind of gently implied relief. It really acts to stabilize and anchor designs that have, of course, been stripped of all of their color fields. So it's actually, I think, a very clever kind of artistic device. It also rather neatly solves a problem that troubled other artists who were engaged on similar quests to get this kind of complex ornament and spatchcock it flat in print publishing, which is where to position the human eye in relation to the design on the page. So if you look at this piece over here by Collinet and de Beaumont, this is from the enormous Encyclopédia des Arts Décoratifs. This is from the Persian volume. It's supposed to be a silver plaque in Tehran. If we zoom in a little, you'll see what I mean about the problem of direction here. You can see that the original drawing of this probably was done just with a section, so probably basically a gore of this, which was then repeated around the central point. What this has created because of the three-dimensionality of it is this weird thing where your eye is, we are seeing from this direction, and we are also seeing from this direction, and we are seeing from this direction and from this direction. If you see what I mean, the edges are shown as if we're seeing from all of those. So it's a weird and very unsatisfying outcome, but it's illustrative of some of the difficulties that are faced by anyone undertaking this kind of design capture. And I think we should never underestimate the work, the scale of the skill involved in the amount of capture that has gone on in the Usul. Similarly, when you compare the line drawings in the Usul with the tile work in real life, which you can do, this is this example here from the Rustam Pasha Mosque over here, you can see very clearly how much the draftsmen have actually created that artificial solidity to the design through this consistent slight directionality of this heavy line, and how this generates its own visual logic that serves to really unify the pages of the Usul. And these individual units, go back within the Usul of these single tiles, I've repeated it here so you can see the patterning in motion. The units in the Usul, they successfully capture a great deal of information, of course, but at the same time, you can see how utterly different the visual effect is in the color tile, where you have parts of the design coming forward and parts receding, of course, because of the use of color. Those linear black and white prints of the Usul are instead rendered into networks of lines that run over and under each other. Now, there are many projects of this type around by the second half of the 19th century, and yet the Usul is, I think, really quite visually distinct. Much, of course, has been written about the volume in the context of Ottoman self-definition, and of course, we have the people who have done some of that work here. This image for me is the best encapsulation of it. It's this incredible image of the evolution of ornamental forms out of regional flora. So as Professor Ersoy has talked about, you know, the specificity of this being regionally specific flora is, of course, important here. So you have pomegranates, melons, and peas here, and they're being deployed to visualize the evolution of a specifically Ottoman Turkish gift for design. I think it's actually kind of an act of genius to get from the pea plant over here to the ornate split palmette here. It's a real kind of sleight of hand, and Mary pointed out in the introduction to this too, that it's not exactly a linear development, it's a kind of pathway here. But arguably, of course, really, this has much more to do with Chinese cloud scrolls than it has to do with NEP plants. And in its diagramming of stylistic evolution, I think the Ussel's plate it's very visionary. It really prefigures visual strategies that are going to get used very directly by Riegel in his Stillfragen 2 decades later. It's very obvious that Riegel was using the Ussel as a direct source because another plate from it appears in a completely direct quotation within Riegel's piece. And in a kind of nice further entanglement for Islamic art historians, Ernst Herzfell's drawings, which are copied from Riegel, kind of take us back again to the Ussel as well. So you can sort of start to get a sense of the entanglement at work in these projects that are going on. But while the Ussel has much in common with other print projects at the time, and it's certainly, I think, thoroughly enmeshed with them, I want to finish by talking about something that I think it does not do, so a way in which I think it is different from quite a number of other projects. Now, the Ussel necessarily does dismember its subject building somewhat. This is part of the process of print capture. It does this, it captures passages of ornament on the page, but it doesn't affect quite the same degree of disjunctive dismemberment that happens in other publications. The individual units in the Ussel have integrity. They tend to feel less ruptured and less ripped apart. Katrin Kaufmann has recently shown that the designs for this hall, this was the hall housing Henry Moser's collection of Oriental arms and armor in Bern. It was designed by Henri Saladin. She showed that the designs on this are copied directly from plates in the Russian Imperial Archaeological Commission's 1905 publication of the Guramir Mosque in Samarkand. Now here, butterflied against empty white surfaces and transposed both the book and the room, they transpose the design from exterior to interior space. In both of these, the book and the hall, the reimagined panels just kind of float on blank grounds. They've lost all the linking registers of design that formed the connective tissue in the original building that this is all copied from. This pairing represents, I think, architectural ornament mediated through print publication and then back out into the world again, transformed into dislocated fields of replication. I do not think that the Ussel quite goes down this road, perhaps because it's so strongly bound up with the project of self-definition, perhaps also because of the speed of its production. This may also be part of it too. But at a time when, let me go back, it was necessary to establish, and again, the introduction to the publication talks about this, it was necessary to establish this Ottoman counter-narrative to a very dominant line of thought. This is a perfect example of it from Raciné, this idea that these were Persian, that these obviously Iznik ceramic productions had to be Persian because of the conception that Turks could not have produced something so good because they were too lowly an artistic race. So in this context, the plates of the Ussel patiently trace Ottoman design in, I think, all of its potentiality, and they endow it with a curiously tensile, a sort of tensile quality through this thick and thin line. Extracted from the surfaces of historic buildings, the motifs in the Ussel are readied on the page for reconfiguration as elements in design pedagogy, as well as narratives of national style. Rather than waiting to be kind of stripped or lifted off the page like those color fields in Raciné, the designs in the Ussel seem to me ready to spring forward of their own accord. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Margaret, thank you so much. I'd invite Zainab Chalik to speak now. Thank you.
Let me begin by thanking everybody without repeating all the names and just joining the chorus of thank yous. I hesitated before accepting Mary's invitation, and Mary was the one who contacted me because I've got Ussel fatigue. Ussel and I have been together for so long that I think you will forgive me for my not great enthusiasm about the book. I am still enthusiastic, but you'll see what I mean. I mean, we go so far way back. I was a student at Istanbul Technical University when I first encountered this volume in the small library of the Architectural History Department, Doğan Kuban's headquarters. And we looked at it and we said, what is this? This is really interesting. And Professor Kuban said to us, there were a couple of us, he said, this is a very important book. Well, I forgot it. Then when I was doing my dissertation research in the early 1980s, here am I, the 19th century person talking about 1880s, I don't go that far back, 1980s, I was scrambling through the architectural pluralism of the late 19th century. And then I found this book again. And it was such a life savior for me because here there was a discourse on trying to find the principles of an architecture that was the basic, that constituted the essence of Ottoman productions, architectural productions. So I was very happy to find it, and the three orders came in handy. In a very fragmented way, I was also able to find a few documents from the archives which talked about the importance of figuring out the rules of Ottoman architecture. So that was that. Then I did my second book on displaying the Orient. And of course, this was on the World's Fairs. And the World's Fairs are extremely important, it turned out, in order to broadcast official images of empires and what they see as their culture. So in displaying the Orient, I again had to deal with usul in the context of the 1873 fair together with Elbise-i Osmani. Again, I've got Elbise fatigue as well. But what is interesting is that the search for the rules of architecture really goes to an earlier fair, to 1867, when Parvile was actually commissioned to design the pavilions for the Ottoman Empire in Paris. He was true to, he thought he was true to certain Ottoman, early Ottoman buildings, and he replicated them in smaller scale in Paris. Now, what to me was really, really important, and I still believe this is important, is that these were written about in a very long article in Gazette des Beaux-Arts in 1863. The author of this article was Anatole de Bordeaux. Bordeaux was a follower of Viollet-le-Duc. He had restored many Gothic churches, medieval churches, and he was a believer in rationalism in architecture, which he understood, like Viollet-le-Duc, using new technology inspired from the principles of Gothic architecture. I'm summarizing it in the most bastardized way, but you know what I'm talking about. So Anatole de Bordeaux is probably known to you by his most famous building, which is Saint-Jean-de-Montmartre, where he used reinforced concrete with steel rods and expressed it both on the exterior and the interior of the building. So in this very long article in, I said Gazette des Beaux-Arts, I'll correct myself, Gazette des Architectes et du Bâtiment is a special issue on the 1867 fair that he dedicates all this space to Ottoman architecture. And he reproduces drawings. Obviously, he had borrowed them from Parvile, they're Parvile's drawings. And he talks about the geometric principles of Ottoman architecture in a very Viollet-le-Duc-like manner. There are sections where he traces lines to explain these geometries, going back to the use of the triangle as an organizer. These are best expressed in the sections, as he argues, and he's referring to the buildings in Bursa that Harbile has brought to public attention in the World's Fairs. So he talks about the harmonic proportions, he talks about the theory of proportions in Ottoman architecture, all from a very rationalistic perspective. So Ahmet talked about absences, where is Harbile? But even more important than that, I believe, is this written analysis, this published analysis of Ottoman architecture. And I cannot but place this in the genealogy of trying to figure out where the whole discussion on the principles of Ottoman architecture came from. Of course, it's very erroneous to say first. We're always wrong when we say first, because there's always something else that precedes it. Hence, so much for the construction raisonnée of Ottoman architecture and its association with the World's Fairs. However, I think what is so important in the 1867 fair is the fact that there were the buildings actually created that seemed to demonstrate the rationalistic principles. So the importance, I'm not going to talk too much about any of these. We can expand on them later on if you want. The importance of Usul is that it was an official document. It represented the Ottoman Empire, and it represented the cultural policies of the Ottoman Empire at the time, and a great deal was happening. However, I have to underline that it is only the official policies that it was reflecting. What is absent from it is, of course, anything else than monuments. And in fact, later Ottoman art historians began to correct this. It is not only the monuments that matter. And it's very early that we encounter an embroadening, shall I say, a more inclusive vision to Ottoman architecture, to local architecture, I should say, in this context. Now, I have to go to the translation business here. And I really, really appreciate all the work that went into it, all the care that went into it. But I think we have to ask ourselves some questions. The book was already published in 3 languages, French, German, and Turkish. And considering the fact that it was addressing clearly an international audience, we might want to consider what it means to translate it into English. The original publication had multi-directional missions. It has absences, it had inconsistencies, but it represented, going back and forth between these languages as well and the multiple authors, it represented something, I don't want to use the word, but I will use it, authentic, about the conditions of its production and what it really stood for. So I wonder if we should complicate where we stand today when we go to this decision of translating the text into English and making it more cohesive, maybe. I'm also wondering what this means, what this says about the state of scholarship and the skills of the architectural historians today, if everything is to be delivered to them on a silver tray. And then my other question is, why translate it from French? I really appreciate the translation, but I'm wondering whether it occurred to, I'm wondering why it was from the French and not the other two languages, or was there some sort of triangulation between the various texts here? And this, I understand that you used modern Turkish spellings, but did you consult the Ottoman versions of these terms? One of the important contributions of the book is, of course, its introduction of a construction terminology into Ottoman architecture, into Turkish, and there are these wonderful terms that they come up with. I think müstevi for the three orders, müstevi, mücevheri, mahruti is the first one. There we have at the beginning of something which later on in the first decade of the 20th century really gets developed to the degree that Celal Esad publishes a dictionary of architectural terms. So these are my comments for now. And thank you again very, very, very much for bringing this book to attention, to scholarly attention again. And listening to the papers, I realized that there's always more to read in an important text such as Usul. Thank you.
Zainab, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for presenting so many different ways of thinking and questioning this project and this text and its utility going forward. I'm wondering whether there are any responses from the panelists to each other or from my co-editor, Gay, as a translator. And questions from our audience. So I invite people to put questions in the chat box or to raise your electronic hand. Okay, did you?
Yeah, so did I raise my hand? I
no, you did.
Myself. I made a stick. Yeah, but just in terms of what Zeynep has just said about the multilingual nature of the book, and why we translated it from the French. De Launay wrote in French, and he's the main author of the book. So it made sense, certainly, to translate from the French. In terms of the presentation in the original of the two columns of French and German, and then the Turkish, of course, I did not consult the Turkish. I don't read Turkish and have no knowledge of it. I do read German. And I did consult the German as I was translating from the French. On occasion, when the French seemed obscure, I would look to the German and I never found any help. And my sense was that the German was translated from the French. It wasn't written in German, right? So it makes, if you're going to do an English translation, and Mary and Sam can speak about the decision to do an English translation, but in terms of that question of the dominance of the French, that was my experience in doing the translation.
Sam, did you want to speak to that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's a wonderful thing when people have had a strong disciplinary formation in architectural history of a certain variety and have the capacity to read French and German and ideally a number of field language, a number of regional languages. But I mean, as soon as one's trying to kind of make interventions with this text and open up conversational spaces, say with scholars who are kind of I mean, recently I've been talking about the text with a number of architects who've been across here from mainland China. I mean, the language we're able to communicate in and we're able to share texts in together is English. It's hard. It's hard with either French or German now to see how some of those kind of new spaces that kind of open up for kind of thinking kind of about the late Ottoman would be able to be if the text only remained in French, German, and Ottoman. So I think, yes, there's certain invidious reasons about what's happened with English as a language, but in terms of creating those, what Emily Apter would call zones of translation, I mean, that the English text is a beginning for people to kind of move into other kinds of translation through that text, especially in kind of South-South conversations. That would be my response.
And I guess this is what I wanted to bring up in terms of where we stand today. English became the lingua franca, and it's going to remain so, is our assumption. And scholars will have to deal with this. I agree.
I think it's also, it pertains to materiality of the text, doesn't it? Once one digitizes something and translates it into any singular language. Because it is such a performance of a trilingual text, and the way one reads images, the directionality of the placement of the images and so forth pertains to that as well, and how we move. But I think that I think it is really important to point to those losses, but also I think to the ways in which this text has been marginalized. I mean, I'm sort of staggered when we went to talk to different publishers about doing this, and it seemed like publishers are only really interested in republishing Owen Jones's Grammar of Ornament. So yeah, the ways in which, I mean, I really hope that people well beyond Ottoman in 19th century French art would actually pick this up, and in British art and so forth, because it is readily available as a text, and then begin to grapple and enter into those conversations. It strikes me how absent it is even from a kind of mainstream of European studies of 19th century art, as well as a more global conversation in art history that is taking place at the moment. Ian, you're on mute.
Sorry, I'm far too modest. I'm on mute. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, good. I mean, the purpose of art in translation isn't solely to take texts to experts in a given field. We have a very, broad readership. And we've translated from Gujarati, from Japanese, from Icelandic, you name it. And we aren't attempting to tell scholars of Gujarati what's important in a Gujarati text. The ambition is also to give people who haven't any expertise in Gujarati some sort of access to this material. So I wouldn't be happy if the perception was that we're only talking in very small groups about very specific things. The ambition of the journal is to be expansive and to bring people from outside specialist fields to give them some insights into the specialist field. Okay, that's me done.
I really don't want the conversation to be oriented only to this issue, and I'm sure there are other people who would like to raise issues related to the other papers that were presented today.
I wanted to actually make a connection perhaps between Margaret's work and the issues about the Ottoman architectural revival that Ahmet invoked through his talk. And I just am really interested in the ways in which the book becomes a medium of translation and detachment and then reattachment to interiors. I was thinking about the ways in which Margaret was talking about unhinging and then replacing back onto the surfaces of buildings. And it really inspires me in relation to some thinking and writing I've been doing recently about artists' Orientalist interiors, like Frederick Church's house on the Hudson River, the ways in which he's sitting with these ornament books and then recreating that back in. And I think the role of the book as a kind of medium of visual translation is there's a much richer history there that still needs to be written in its kind of global contours, or in its international contours anyway, in terms of practice of translation. I'm just wondering whether either of you had any further comments you wanted to make about that.
I actually had my hand up for a while, but
oh, sorry, I hadn't seen that, Ahmet. Please.
And I was also going to ask a question to Margaret about. I enjoyed her presentation tremendously, and I was curious to hear more about how she would compare these tensile drawings, line drawings in the usul, with those used by Parvile, for instance, in as an expert on ceramics. How does he translate the medium into 2 dimensions, and do you see any correlations or differences?
Thank you so much. Yes, I think I should explain the background to this too, which is that what I was presenting there was part of an article, which I'm happy to say has just come out. It's the first thing I wrote in the pandemic, and it's just come out recently. It's a weird marker of time. Which is specifically, it's called Spatchcocking the Arabesque. It's for a book about the arabesque, but it's I was trying in it to grapple with 2 things. One was being in a room full of Europeanists who kept talking about the arabesque, and my sense of what is anyone actually meaning when they're saying this word. But secondly, I was very, very interested in the way that print production has generated this, what I called spatchcocking, which is actually, I don't know if you're all familiar with it. It's a culinary term. It's what you do with a chicken. You especially do it with a poussin. You split it up the back and flatten it out in order to basically butterfly it for cooking. So the violence inherent in the term was deliberate. But so I came to the usul through that article, which is a kind of a long article where I looked at quite a lot of different publications of these super books that I was talking about. They're so big, so many of them. And I feel like I haven't investigated it enough, because it was, for the purposes of that article, I looked at the usul and I could see that it's different. It is different. And I do think, as I was looking at it again, I wondered how much of that is to do with the speed with which it was produced. So that line, it's an economical system that they use for the data capture that they're doing in all of those pages. But that decision to give that kind of dimensionality is a striking one. It seems different to me. I can't off the top of my head think of what Parvile does that's similar. There are other things that are being done by other people, like the ones I showed, like Colline de Beaumont, Racinet, and all of those kind of sub-Racinet publications that follow him as well, which tend to be, they're more focused on smaller fields. They tend to do more awkward things, I find, as well. Colline and de Beaumont, if you revisit that publication, you find some really weird things being done in order to get 3-dimensional surfaces onto 2 dimensions. And Prix d'Aven, in the later volume, he just outright skins the objects. Some of them are completely skinned and flattened on the page. So it's something I think I need to think about more. And I was very interested, of course, in the images that you showed in this question of how the revivalist program was making use of this. It's a sort of act of mobilization that these print books are enabling, and the usul is doing it. It's doing it too, where you can get it from one surface, put it in the book, and then it can be mobilized out again. It's very obvious when you look at certain types of book, the grammar of ornament, we'll never get away from it, really. It is a sort of paradigm. What you can see happening there is the snippeting, the filleting of things into little bits to get the maximum amount of information onto the page for then peeling it off and reproducing it, usually in repetition. design contexts. The Usul is doing something a bit different. It takes larger sections. It seems to much prefer whole fields to that kind of cutting up that we see in many of the European, especially the grammars. But you also do in some of the more architectural books, you also see that kind of cutting up and stripping out. So that's a long-winded way of saying I don't know, and I'm just preparing my comments for today made me realize, because I'm really an objects person, I've primarily thought about this from the ceramics design perspective, made me realize, and your comments made me realize how much this fits with the question of architectural revivalism too, and how clearly you could actually manipulate those. So I was curious if you had thoughts about places where you could see this in action as well.
I have no idea. I really never have thought about it this way. I was just curious whether, I mean, like these people like Maya, who are both involved in ceramic production alongside Parvier, I mean, what would it mean to them to translate this the texture of the ceramic into these monochrome linear drawings? And I was wondering whether a connection could be made between the practice and the drawings, but I think there's a lot to be thought about there. So many thanks for the comments.
Just immediately, it makes me think of the surfaces of the way Frederick Church is actually working in Olana with the surface of his interior, and he's translating primarily from the Persian source books, and actually putting metal bosses in and to dimensionalize what is essentially a painted decoration that he's doing. So I'm really, and if one compares that, say, to Leighton, where there's actually cracked tiles that he's got from Damascus that he's actually repairing. So I think it's really fascinating to think about this kind of three-stage process with the books as the sort of intermediary between these actual spaces. And yeah, thank you for such a provoking and detailed way of thinking about those, the way the book renders these surfaces.
Can I ask in there? This is either to Margaret or to that. I mean, I remember when they were setting up it must have been 2017, when they were just setting up the World Museum in Vienna, that the director came across to the museum where I was and was presenting, and I haven't been across to it, but they've apparently they've set up they've set up like one kind of part of the permanent exhibition space in terms of the 1873 fair, and they've focused it on the Japanese collection. And I remember asking him at the time, what happened with whether there were Ottoman objects in Viennese collections or that became Austrian collections that had come from the fair. And so he put me on to their kind of Ottoman, their kind of Islamic arts curator, and who we had a brief correspondence, and apparently there are, but it's hard to kind of track things down. And then I kind of ended up in the field and didn't follow it up. But I'm just wondering, in terms of following through the Regal connection, is there like kind of like what research has been done on what happened with objects from the Ottoman contribution to the fair, whether they ended up how many ended up in Viennese collections, with Regal's own kind of museological side, with are there kind of object dimensions that are going to follow through to trace the Regal dimension as well?
I'm going to just straight up say I don't know. It's really interesting, but I do not know the answer to that.
Erin.
I don't have a good answer to this question either, but I do know that Ahmet and I were at a conference in Vienna, at the University of Vienna, in November that was on the Islamic presence at the 1873 World's Fair. And there were a couple of papers on Regal's relationship to the fair. And I will spare you trying to regurgitate whatever those brilliant scholars were trying to say. But I do think that, as far as I know, there will be a publication, and so that there is scholarship in process on that relationship. And I don't know if it will fully answer your question, but I know people are thinking about that. Specifically Eva Trollenberg and Barry Flood, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly.
Ian, you're muted.
If I could stick with the Austrian connection again, I mean, I'm a complete outsider in this field, so it's perhaps a daft question, but one does think about the relationship between the Usul and the costume folio, the costume book. The great German theorist Semper, Gottfried Semper, argued in the 1860s that the first step of architecture was costume. Bekleidung was the beginning of architecture, the festival tent and so on. The soft drape, the carpet was the beginning of architecture. And I mean, is there any sort of Semperian parallel, should we say, between having a book on costume and a book on architecture?
May I? Oh,
yes,
sorry.
please.
Erin, please go ahead.
Go ahead. I'll go after you.
Okay. No, I was just thinking about the categories that were prescribed by the exhibition. And so I think while the Ottomans had very little kind of budget for this exhibitionary enterprise, they were they thought that they would have to perform in these certain areas like architecture, local costume, at least on the scholarly level, and hence the decision to publish these books. So there might have been an indirect connection there to Semper, because these categories emerged within the context of the exhibitions themselves, especially in the German-speaking world.
Erin.
Yeah, I don't know if I have a great answer to this question, but you raise a point that I have been trying to think through, and is something that I'm still kind of wrestling with, is on a more theoretical level, this relationship between costume, right? The donning of a costume and the structure of a building, and how these two things on a more theoretical level relate to each other, and how do they exist then within the albums as these objects that require a body to engage with them, right? Like the clothing requires a body to be worn, and the building requires a body to inhabit it, or to experience it. And so there is some relationship there that I have not quite fully unpacked, but I do think that there is some connection there, and I don't know if it goes back to Semper or not, or but I think that it's something about this, particularly with the costume album, this idea that the identity is located I believe, in the details of the costumes and not necessarily in the sitters themselves. And then also is the identity, right, as messy and problematic as it is in the Usul, also within the architectural formations as well, like in the detailing of them. And I don't, again, I haven't fit all the pieces together, but I do think you raise a really important point that again connects these albums in ways that are maybe not so obvious, but also are important. And again, the other connection between them is, of course, this idea, which on a logistical level you pointed to, Ahmed, but that both of these things deal with questions of the domestic, right? Like the buildings, even if they're religious buildings, and then clothing, right? And I think there's something about that to me that is really interesting. And again, I haven't figured out, but like this emphasis on the domestic, and then how gender plays into that too, which is something that again it needs to be understood within these spaces. And again, I don't have a good answer for it today, but it's something that I'm trying to think about. within these different these spaces on the page and on the album page and on the exposition stage as well.
Thank you. I might be misremembering this, and perhaps one of our panelists can correct me, but I think Semper actually works on the Ottoman displays in 1851, doesn't he, in London?
Yeah.
So yeah, I should think there's quite possibly some interesting threads of connection there. Are there any other final comments that people might like to make, or reflections? Gay, you need to unmute.
Yeah, about costume and architecture and the connections, theoretical, how to get at this. I think performance is actually a good place to start thinking in theorizing, because both costume and buildings are actually performative, and so that just coming in from my own perspective there. And another thing I just wanted to say, I'm swept away by the wonderful scholarship demonstrated by particularly by Erin and Margaret, because that kind of analysis of the images is new to me, and I loved it, and I think fantastic work there. But I am noticing that a lot of, maybe this is because of the art historical nature of this gathering, but I am noticing that there's a lot of emphasis on the pictures and not much on the text. And having labored over that text, I would hope to see some scholarship addressed to this wonderful writing. Yeah.
Did anyone want to respond to that or make any other final comments? I think this has been a wonderfully productive conversation, and perhaps this is the moment at which to really thank each of our four speakers for such wonderfully thoughtful responses, generative and part of an ongoing conversation around these texts. So thank you very much, everybody, and for our audience attending. It's terrific to be part of a conversation around this project. And again, thank you to Art in Translation, Ian and the team, and Mira for organising this launch. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.